But yeah, seriously, Zadbash is Aleph and Tataf and Beit and Sheen, so it wouldn't work out. When it becomes a Tet. There's a Tel to the first, but it's interesting. In the Marsha printed in the Gemara, it's like that.
Okay, we're just discussing some of the names of Mashiach mentioned before. So two things we'll mention. First of all, something nice that you just mentioned from the Gra. The four names mentioned yesterday about who Mashiach is. Menachem, not in order, but I'm doing it in order of the way the Gra puts it.
Not in order of the Gemara.
Menachem begins with the Mem, Shila begins with the Yud, Shin, Yinon begins with the Yud, and Chanina begins with the Ches. The first letters of the name spell out the word Mashiach. Which is a nice, interesting thing. Another thing is someone commented on one of the places online that there's a medrash which says that Mashiach had 7 names, and the person commented correctly and interestingly that it follows the pattern of Moshe Rabbeinu and Yisrael, which both have 7 names. In the context of that medrash, which gives 7 names to Mashiach, and the way the Gemara here gives 4 names to Mashiach, it's a bit different. So I was telling Rebbe before. The medrash there, which says that Mashiach has 7 names, is context free. It just says he has 7 names. And there are many times throughout Jewish literature where people have more than one name. We learned before this Masechta, 3 Masechtas ago, I think, Megillah, where the Gemara says that Achashverosh had more than one name, or no, not Achashverosh, Esther, Mordechai, Achashverosh also, right? I don't think so. I think it was Esther for sure and Mordechai also. And the Gemara tells us, well, what was his real name? And then what was his secondary name? Like Esther and Hadassah, what was the real name? Was real name Hadassah and Esther was because of concealment, or was it real name Esther and Hadassah is for... So when you have that kind of thing with the Gemara where Jewish literature gives a person more than one name, it's because all those names convey some thing about that person, about the person's character, about that person's ability, about that person's accomplishments. With Moshe Rabbeinu, Yisrael, and others. And the same thing would be true, seemingly, of that medrash giving 7 names to Mashiach. And that these names are identifying markers about who Mashiach is and what he does and what's supposed to accomplish. Over here, it's similar, but it's a bit different. Because over here, it's not the Gemara listing, pulling names out of a hat, so to speak. But rather, it's a bunch of different groups of people, each saying that the name of Mashiach matches the name of their teacher. So it's more of a subjective experience. Like we experience, which is what I suggested yesterday, that each student, each one of the groups of students are talking about their teacher as the one who brought them, and they feel the world closer to Mashiach's state. So therefore they said Mashiach must have a name similar to our teacher, because our teacher is bringing us closer to a messianic state through his Torah teaching, etc. As we explained yesterday. So I think it's a bit different, although they're not in contradiction, but I think they're a bit different, those two sources. This one and the medrash there. Okay.
The last one is not a name.
It's not a name, it's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, just the
Mitzvah of Rebbe. Yeah. Okay. It's actually also interesting that the Menachem ben Chizkiah doesn't say who said that. The other ones, it says the people of the house of Yanai said Yino, the people of the house of Shiloh said Shiloh. When it comes to Menachem ben Chizkiah, I'm at the wrong page. When it comes to Menachem ben Chizkiah, it just says Yesh Omer, those who say. It doesn't say the people of the house of Menachem ben Chizkiah. It doesn't say that. So there must have been some tradition, as you're pointing out, especially since our Gemara says Menachem son of Chizkiah as the Yesh Omer. Rashi quotes the word Menachem and then adds the words ben Chizkiah. As if in Rashi's Gemara it only said the word Menachem, didn't say ben Chizkiah, and Rashi's adding for you, it's ben Chizkiah. Which means, even for those who didn't have a text where the Gemara itself said ben Chizkiah, there was a tradition that's ben Chizkiah. So for some reason there's a tradition that's Menachem ben Chizkiah, as opposed to the other 3 names where it says the people of the house of Shiloh said it's Shiloh, the people of the house of Yanai said Yinon, etc. It's just an interesting thing to note. Okay. Now going forward, we have 2 pieces of Gemara which we hope to get through. Both of which talk about the identity and the personality, the role and the identity of Mashiach himself. First identity, then role. And I think in the context of the way we explained the previous Gemara, we'll be able to understand the next Gemara coming forward, especially since it has an apparent halachic contradiction. There's a Rashi, we'll get to that and we'll talk about all of this. Okay, so let's look at the Gemara first of all. Chelek Chesed Beis 98b. The line begins with the word Amar Rabbi Nachman. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines on the bottom of the page. So the Chesed Beis, the first word, Amar Rabbi Nachman.
Nachmanides?
No. Way earlier. Okay. Nachmanides is a medieval post-Talmudic commentary. This is Rav Nachman of the Talmudic era. He actually served as exilarch at one point.
That's who? What?
The exilarch. Exilarch means the person who both had rabbinic and political authority over Jewish people in the exile, in Bavel.
Babylon.
Yeah, the Jewish people had a state within a state outside of Israel for close to 1,000 years, because it even traveled with them at some points even to Europe. Not in Sfarad, but in Ashkenaz, like in the Rhinelands. There's areas that the Jews had their own, they called it the Kahal. I think the Kahal, like the idea of a Rosh Kahal, the head of a community called Rosh Kahal, comes from the original system of a Kahal, which was like a Jewish establishment that was responsible for, even to a degree, like Jewish taxes and commerce, and sometimes even had like full political
Powers?
Yeah, because we have separation of church and state, but when you had the church and the state are intertwined, so what do you do with Jews who have a different church, different religious life? What do you do? So for a lot of times they gave the Jews their own authority to run their own business, their own stuff, and as long as they paid the right dues and whatever. Sometimes it caused problems, sometimes it was helpful. Anyway, so it started in Bavel when the Jews had this thing called the exilarch, the Reish Galusa. So Rav Nachman served as that for a while. Anyway, interesting history in of itself. So Rav Nachman said, it's a very interesting statement that the Gemara is going to read, so I'm going to translate it literally, and we'll try to explain it. Im min chaya. I'm going to start with the first interpretation of Rashi. Rashi gives two interpretations. We'll start with the first one. Rav Nachman says, Im min chaya. If Mashiach is going to be of those who live, if God decides to choose someone who's currently alive to be the Mashiach, it'll be me. I'll do it. If God wants to choose someone that's alive. Yeah. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, this is what he says, imagine. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, V'hoya adiri mimenu, u'mashale mikir ba yotze. It's a pasuk which basically implies that the strength and leadership comes from within, meaning not someone superimposed somewhere outside, but rather someone who's within the community and already has a leadership, and then he emerges as the Mashiach. So he's in a position of leadership. I just mentioned he's the exilarch. This is presumably why he's saying this. So I'm in the position already. So if God decides he wants to make Mashiach now, I'm ready to take the role. I'm available. Halavai, Hashem took his chutzpah. Would have saved herself 2,000 years of suffering. Okay, but Rav Nachman here says, Imin Chaya, if it's someone who's alive, which means maybe it's not from someone who's alive. So it could be, he's talking about, well, maybe it's someone who hasn't been born yet. Right? But now we have a different statement from Rav, which changes it a bit. Amar Rav says, Imin Chaya, if it's going to be someone who's alive, then Gogoy Rabbeinu HaKadosh. It'll be, not himself, but Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbeinu HaKadosh is the author of, the compiler, I should say, of the Mishnah. Right, Rabbi, known all over as Rebbe, just plain Rebbe, our teacher. Rabbeinu HaKadosh here means our holy teacher. He is responsible for canonizing and committing to writing the oral part of the Torah, Teresh Bal Peh. So he's a figure that essentially is responsible for the fact that we're sitting and learning Gemara. The fact that we are sitting and Orthodox Jews till today is because he did that. Seeing, it's post-destruction of the temple, Jews are still living in Israel, but seeing that the Jewish establishment in Israel is not lasting, although there is a Jewish establishment, there's an exilarch out in Bavel, and sometimes there's actually competing, like for who's the most authoritative Jewish leadership in Bavel or in Eretz Yisrael. Like the people of Bavel felt that they had more clout because they had more scholarship and certainly more money, but the people in Israel felt that they had the more spiritual, moral high ground because they were in Israel and they quote verses that the Torah has to flow from Israel. But at any rate, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi seeing all these problems and realizing that a centralized Jewish authority is not going to last forever because you got exiled from Israel, you get exiled from Bavel, you get exiled from somewhere else, which he was right about. And he figured therefore the only way to preserve Jewish identity and Jewish learning is by putting it in writing. Even though, from the halachic perspective, one is not allowed to write down the oral tradition. God spoke it, he didn't write it, you don't write it. But he cited a verse, a play on the words, which says that in order to preserve Torah, you might have to overlook one part of Torah. So the one part of Torah which says not to write Torah down, he's going to overlook in order to preserve the very Torah which says you can't write it down. And the irony is that in the Gemara itself, it's written down, the law that says you can't write it down. That's how I know the law, it's in the Gemara. But this is Rabbeinu HaKadosh. He was a massive thinker on a global scale who was responsible for saving Judaism, and not just also, besides for all of that, he was a known, like Rashi says, he was known pious, Chassid Gomor, completely pious. He also says Sovel Tachloim. He also carried the burden of Jewish suffering.
He was personally sick for many.
He was personally very sick, even though he was very, very wealthy, and he had also political connections. He was like the perfect Jewish leader. Torah scholarship, money, suffered with the people, and had political connections. So says Rebbe, says Rav.
Just like the Maharash, exactly the same.
Maharash also was very wealthy. Torah scholarship, had political connections, and suffered physically. It's true, yeah. That's right. And died young.
Yeah.
Rebbe also didn't die very. No, he was older. Anyway, so Rav says if it's going to be someone living, we're going to pick Rebbe. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, that he can do it.
Didn't they know that it was supposed to come from the lineage of King David?
These people did come from the lineage of David.
Sure.
Rabbeinu HaKadosh came from David, and assumed Rav Nachman also did. I assume.
Yeah, because the exile came from the line.
The exile came from the land of David. That's right. They kept that tradition.
On Miriam's side or Ruth's side?
That would be the father's side. The father from the
It
father.
would be from their father's side, but the Rus comes before David, right? So if you come from David, you come from Rus automatically because Rus comes before, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but here now comes the interesting part, where whereas till this point you could say the Gemara said if it's from the living, then Rav Nachman says it's me, or Rav Chia says it's, or Rav said
It's Rabbeinu Kadosh.
Rav Chia says it's Rabbeinu HaKadosh.
Is it Rav?
No, it's Rav. Sorry, I'm just saying Chayachi. If it's, and Rav says Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rebbe, Rebbe Nasi, or different names he's referred to. And we could assume that what they mean, if it's from the living, what they mean is if it's coming now. But if it comes later, it'll be somebody else. But here the Gemara now goes backwards in history, which becomes an interesting sort of problem, which Rashi has to address, and then we'll add some elements. It says like this: Imin Masya Messiah, if it's from those who have already passed, which means if God decides he's going to take someone who've already passed on and choose him to be Mashiach, resurrect him and make him Mashiach. So then it's going to be Daniel Ish Chumdois. It'll be Daniel, the man of pleasantries, the beloved, the cherished man, referring to Daniel, the one who was in the lion's den. So here's again someone who suffered along with Jewish people, obviously pious, Torah scholarship, a prophet, and was a big leader of the Jewish people.
And also connected with the government. Yeah.
And had political connections. He had all the criteria. Okay, so that's one interpretation of Rashi. Another interpretation of Rashi is not that it would have actually been Rabbeinu HaKadosh or actually Daniel, but rather that if Mashiach shares similarities with someone who's alive, if he would share similarities like Rabbeinu HaKadosh, or if he shared similarities with someone who has passed on, it would be someone similar to Daniel, but not that it's actually Daniel and actually Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Why is Rashi doing that? What's wrong with just saying it might be Daniel? The problem, it seems to me, would be because the halacha is the halachic version of Mashiach, as we described there a few times, quoting from the Rambam, who's basically the halachic authority on the identity of Mashiach and the laws of Mashiach, is someone who lives for years and has a whole process of things he has to do. He has to restore the Davidic line. He has to gather in all the Jewish people. He has to build a temple. He has to inspire the Jews to return to Judaism. He has to end war, suffering. The whole list of things he has to do, and especially if you understand the Rambam the way that Rebbe does, and like many others, it has to go in order. And there's quite a strong indication from the Rambam that it has to be in order, even though there are others that learn it could be out of order. But certainly from the most straightforward halachic reading of the Rambam, it has to be in order. Now if that's the case, how do you pick someone who passed away? The Rambam writes that if he's killed, you know he's not Mashiach, you know that he did great things, he was an amazing man, but he's not Mashiach himself. And the Rambam uses the example of Bar Kokhba, where Rabbi Kiva, we talked about it before, Bar Kokhba is the last ditch effort of the Jews who were living in Israel some 60 or 70 years after destruction to try to overthrow the Romans and restore Jewish sovereignty. And Rabbi Kiva, according to the Rambam, many others as well, felt that Bar Kochba was it. In other words, there were 70 years between the first and second temple. It's been 70 years since the second temple. Let's overthrow the Romans, build the third temple, and this is it. It's done. Right? What are we, 2,000 years? What's the way that for? They didn't even imagine that was a thing. 70 years is enough, finished. But he failed. He was killed. So it says the Rambam, so if he was killed, then you know he was a great guy, did fantastic things, but he's not Mashiach. But the Rambam doesn't say if he died. It just says if he was killed. But even if not so, but for the very fact that the Rambam describes this whole list of this process that Mashiach has to do, then if he passed away in the middle, then he stopped. He didn't finish doing the process. So even if he's a fantastic person, and even if you want to say he reached the point of Cheskas Mashiach, the Rambam gives two stages. That if he does this, which is one of the rayos, by the way, it has to be in order. That Rambam says that if he did this, that, and the other, then he is presumably Mashiach. And if he does this, then he's definitely Mashiach. Right? So it's possible that a person could reach the stage where he is presumably Mashiach because he's accomplished X, Y, Z, but he hasn't done A, B, C yet, and therefore because he passed away, so then he's a great guy, he did all these fantastic things, but he's not Mashiach yet. Now if that's the case, then how could the Gemara say that if it's like someone who passed away, it's Daniel? How could it be someone who died? He tried doing things, he stopped. He didn't make it to the end. So therefore Rashi would have to say, in the second interpretation of Rashi, not that it's actually Daniel, but that if we're going to identify someone in history who has the messianic criteria, it would have been someone like Daniel. Not that it's Daniel himself. That's the second interpretation of Rashi. Now we're left with trying to understand the first interpretation of Rashi. How do you understand the first interpretation that's literally Daniel? Because that's at least one interpretation of Rashi, which seems to contradict the halacha of what Mashiach has to do. So there's different things you can suggest. On a spiritual level, we already talked about this before, since we talked about yesterday about how each of these groups of students identified their teacher as the name of Mashiach, sharing the name with their teacher because they looked at their teacher as someone who was in the process of bringing Mashiach closer, teaching them Torah, bringing them closer to a messianic state, and therefore they said Mashiach has to have that name. So in a similar vein, you could look at history and say, who are these people who lived a life that actually moved the dial on Mashiach's coming significantly? Meaning if every Jew doing a mitzvah turns the dial slowly towards the messianic state, right? A Jew who lived 1,000 years ago, didn't see Mashiach in his lifetime, was still part of the process of Mashiach's coming. He just turned the dial by that. But then you can identify people who took the dial and really turned it, right? So you look at history and you find those people, Daniel, Rabbi Kaddish, and you say that their souls are very strong Mashiach souls. And in that sense, you could say they are Mashiach, even if they aren't technically Mashiach, which means another way of saying it is like this: even if they aren't the halachic Mashiach, they certainly were the spiritual Mashiach. In the sense that, as we talked about before, every Jew has a spiritual Mashiach within him, because every Jew has the capability of bringing Mashiach a little bit closer. The question is to what degree you live that. And there were Jews in history who lived that on a massive scale, and therefore they were Mashiach in that spiritual sense, even if they didn't make it to the halachic finish line of who Mashiach is. That's number one. Certainly. It's the same thing as if you want to go like the Kabbalistic way, and since you mentioned Mordechai, right? There's a medrash which says that Moshe in his generation, Moses, is like Mordechai in his generation. And you also have other medrashim which talk about Mashiach, that Moshe Rabbeinu is the first Redeemer, and Moshe Rabbeinu is also the last Redeemer, as in Moshe Rabbeinu himself is the Mashiach. It means literally Moshe is the last Mashiach.
He can't because he's like Shevet Levi, yeah.
He's Shevet Levi, he already passed away. So we're talking about a spiritual soul sense that Moshe Rabbeinu was, obviously, a full-out Mashiach living soul, in that he brought the people, probably most significantly, towards the Messianic era, pre-giving of Torah to post-giving of Torah, right? So, and Mordechai as well, in his generation, did the same thing. And therefore, in every generation, or Pinchas Eliyahu, you have all kinds of midrashim that have this kind of implication to a spiritual identity of what a Jewish leader is, / Mashiach, / Moshe Rabbeinu, / Rabbeinu HaKadosh, / Daniel, all having the same, being part of the same process and bearing the same spiritual flag and energy that brings the world and Jewish people closer to the Messianic state. That's one way you can read this Gemara, which is probably the easiest.
They can all be resurrected.
Right? Now comes the other thing, resurrection.
That's a possibility. Yeah.
Now we had before in the Gemara like this. The Gemara told us before that there are two methods in which Mashiach can come. We had we can identify them as, let's say, Be'itoy and Bachishena. We had Mashiach coming in its due time, which means regardless of how the Jews are behaving or what's going on, Mashiach comes in a slow process. It means it doesn't matter what happens, the world evolves towards a messianic state. Or God can decide, you know what, right here, right now, we're breaking the process, bam, Mashiach's coming. We even talked about how you can combine the two together, but let's just keep it separate for a second, right? And we also had similarly Mashiach coming on a donkey versus Mashiach coming on clouds, the natural order or the supernatural order. If that's the case, one might suggest, and we talked about an indication from the Rambam himself that this is true, and I'll remind you about that in a second, that when the Rambam describes the slow process of Mashiach coming, which if you read the process, it takes years and years and years, and there's a specific order, and you have to do this first and that second. That's a reference to, or that's a description of, the halachic requirement for what has to happen in this world to progress to Mashiach's coming. But if God decides right now, you know what, we're putting a pause in this process for making Mashiach come now, even though the world is, 10 years off, 100 years, whatever it is, off the process of Mashiach's coming. Now, once you're breaking those rules, you can break the rules completely. And God could say, okay, I'm taking Daniel, picking him out from the dead, resurrecting him, making Mashiach. Well, why not? Because he can do whatever he wants.
That's why I'm not drinking.
Exactly, and that's what I want to reference. What's the proof that's possible? From the fact that we mentioned this before, that the Rambam says that halacha is we don't rule this way, we allow a kohen to drink. But the Rambam writes that a kohen is not allowed to drink because within the span of time it takes him to sober up, he might have to be in the temple serving. Now, if we're following a natural order of Mashiach's coming, the temple hasn't been built yet. It's going to take us years, naturally speaking, to build a temple. So, you can drink now. By the time the temple is built, you will be sobered up, right? And when you see the temple is almost done, don't drink because you might have to go in there. But the Rambam says no, you can't drink now because you might in 2 seconds, you might within 18 minutes. I think that's the amount of time it takes to sober up from a glass of wine. You might have to be in the temple, which is proof that even though there is a halachic process which takes years for Mashiach's coming, it could be happening instantaneously. So when the Rambam said that the Mashiach has to be this living person who does this and does that and does this and that, etc., 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 then it makes sense that then it would be difficult to understand and say that there's a Mashiach coming from someone who's already passed. But if we can assume, and we hope this happens, even if to wait for the whole end of the process, even though, as we've discussed, we are clearly very close to the end of the process. But if God decides, that's it, I'm making Mashiach come now, he could pick anyone from anywhere in history. And that is perhaps what Rebbe would mean, what Rav would mean in the first interpretation of Rashi. He's literally talking about Daniel, and that God can decide right now, even though we're thousands, clearly he was 1,500 years off from the process, because we're 1,500 years later. God can decide right now, we're picking Daniel, and that's it, making a Mashiach finished. The process takes longer, too bad, finished, we're making it happen anyway now.
Or it could still be a resurrection, and one person is resurrected, and then there's a regular process.
Once the Rambam writes that there's no break in nature happens. Once you do the resurrection, a break in nature happens.
Others argue that there can be a mixture of Nes and Tava.
From the halach perspective, lav dafka. But anyway, I'm saying that even in the Rambam,
the other way to get around
I'm suggesting that even in the Rambam, sorry? That's a spiritual thing. I'm talking about halachic. I'm saying even from the Rambam's halach perspective, there's a proof from the story with the kohen who can't drink, that even though you accept the halachic process, Hashem could break it. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to say that the fact that the halachic process exists does not negate the fact that Hashem could transcend it and make it happen without
Hashem
that.
himself says we don't know what's going to happen until everything happens. So Hashem can have
he says it with the miracles, which is a separate thing. Everyone has a little Mashiach in them.
But they have to come to the line of David. So Kohen can't be Mashiach. But he can still count.
Anyway, okay. He's a joke.
Yeah. No, that's clear. That's clear. It has to be line of David. That's for sure.
Okay, who has the time now?
Tribe of Judah.
It's almost 9 o'clock.
Okay, so we're going to stop over here.
Yeah.
And tomorrow we have another Gemara about the identity of Mashiach, which is very, very interesting. And the Rebbe has a pilpul. The Rebbe has a dissertation that lasted for years. Meaning he never spoke about it in a letter once, and then another talk, all on this very Gemara. And the next Gemara about about who Mashiach is, king, teacher, nasi, melech, what this all means. And we'll talk about that, God willing, tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Maybe. I don't know.
I have to ask you about the Mashiachists. Those who believe that the Rebbe is the Mashiach.
So I kind of alluded to it already in this whole thing, that there are two ways to look at that, or I should say 3 ways. One way is you don't care. That's the simplest way. Who cares? Whoever God wants to be Mashiach, let him be Mashiach. Here you have in the Gemara people who did care. They said, I want him to be my teacher. I want him to share the name of my teacher. I want it to be this one.
Wouldn't that be the Moshiach who's these people believe that the Rebbe
So one way of looking at it is one person.
many of the qualities.
Yeah. So one person might say that if God decides to pick somebody out of the hat, then let him pick the Rebbe. Someone might say that, and if they want to say that, fine. I have no problem with that. Then there's a third option, which is a little bit more questionable. People who think that the Rebbe is the halachic Mashiach. Now, to me, you're crossing a line when you say that.
Ooh.
That's why I made this distinction between the halachic Mashiach. When there's halachic Mashiach, then you have to follow halachic criteria, and there's a process you need to follow. And if you can prove that exists, good luck. But if you're talking about the fact that God can do whatever He wants, and like the Gemara here, Rav Chia says, well, put it this way: the fact that Rav gives options. In other words, if Rav felt that Rabbeinu HaKadosh was the halachic Mashiach, why would he give an option? It is Rabbeinu HaKadosh, just like Rabbi Kiva didn't give options. Rabbi Kiva said it is Bar Kochba. But over here he gives options. If it's going to be someone who's living, it's Rebbe. If it's going to be someone who's passed away, it's Daniel. So what is he saying? What he's really saying is, look, these are two people I've identified that, to me, fit the bill. And therefore, you know what? I think that they should be the two. Or they would be one. From the fact that he gives options means he himself is saying, I could be wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't give options. Rabbi Kiva didn't give options. He said, Rabbi Bar Kochba is it. He's following the process. He must be it. Right? So when you go that route, you have a little bit of a problem. If you're talking about a spiritual thing that God can choose somebody and you feel that this is a good choice, fine, go think that. I don't care. It doesn't bother me. Hope that's somewhat clear.
He picked Moshe Rabbeinu out of nowhere.
Yeah, well, Moshe Rabbeinu is a Levi.
He's a Levi.
So he couldn't be an actual Mashiach, the halachic Mashiach, certainly not. Even though the Medrash said that he is Mashiach in terms of the spiritual sense, we talked about that before.
But he picked him out of nothing, like he was a nobody. He was just a...
Yeah.
And he made him to a leader and a prophet and everything else.
Yeah. Let me add another element to that. There's in the Shalat and other places, there's a lot of sources on this, and I don't want to open a full can of worms, but just to give a little bit of clarity, because I know it confuses a lot of people. In this context, if this is the context that you're thinking about it, in terms of the spiritual process towards Mashiach's coming, then any person who teaches Torah is Mashiach-esque.
Okay.
Because he's bringing more godliness into this world and helping people reveal godliness in their life. Right? Every Jew has a part of the neshama. Let's put it this way: if the definition of Mashiach is a time when godliness is revealed, every Jew has a part of the neshama where godliness is revealed. And the job of any good teacher is to help that Jew reveal that part of his neshama. So every person engaged in revealing his own neshama, revealing his own godly soul, and helping others reveal their godly soul is a Mashiach-esque person, which is what we talked about yesterday, how each of these people are finding the name of Mashiach in their teacher. Because they look at their teacher and they say, look, this teacher did it to me. Right? So in that sense, throughout history, there are many, many, many people, starting right from the Gemara, who looked at their teacher and said, yeah, that's Mashiach. Were they wrong?
It's Mashiach-esque.
They were Mashiach in the spiritual sense, not in the halachic sense.
Yeah.
In the same way Moshe Rabbeinu was Mashiach, Mordechai was Mashiach, Rabbeinu HaKadosh is Mashiach, Daniel is Mashiach, and all these other people we identify are Mashiach in that spiritual sense. So if that's the realm you're talking in, you can say it about anybody. If they truly, and also there's degrees. The degree to which I live my godly soul and the degree to which the Rebbe lives his godly soul is a whole different world, right? So to what degree am I living Mashiach spiritually? I don't know. To what degree is the Rebbe living Mashiach spiritually? It's a whole different level, right? So it puts in context where this comes from. But once you cross the line from spiritual Mashiach, and that this is a person who turned the dial significantly, like Daniel or Rabbeinu HaKadosh or these people, and especially as we're getting closer to Mashiach's coming, every degree counts in a way more significantly than it did in the times of Daniel and the times of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, because we're closer to it. So the more you flip the dial, the more potent your contributions are. So if that's the context you're speaking, I have no problem. Once you cross that line and you say we're talking about halachic definition, now already you run into bigger problems. Because you have to look at the halachic markers, build temple, restore the Davidic line, ingathering of all the Jewish people, and a whole list and
eventually world peace.
And world peace and world peace and all the other things.
It's problematic.
Yeah. Like I don't want to open up another Pandora's box, but
there's lots of cancer worms available here.
Yeah, but I hope I'm giving clear where I think the line is.
Spiritual versus Or some also called the role of a Mashiach role versus the actual Mashiach. Each person played a role in Mashiach. We're bringing it closer by his own mitzvah.
And here's the other thing.
Like for example, the Koresh is called Mashiach.
Yeah.
How could it be? He's not even Jewish. But he played a Mashiach role in the sense that he helped to build the temple.
So I want to add another element. When you're talking about Chassidus, from the Chassidic perspective, in a certain degree, the spiritual identity of Mashiach is almost more important than the halachic one. Because, and I'll tell you why. Because you and I, right here now, we cannot play the halachic role of Mashiach. What are we going to do? There's very little we can do in the halachic sense to bring Mashiach. In the spiritual sense, there's a lot we can do. Now, when Mashiach actually comes, it's a convergence of this halachic and spiritual sense. But our real contribution, I think I talked about this once before, Mashiach has a political role, Mashiach has a spiritual role, and Mashiach has a religious role. And you have to think about your own life and see where you fit into this picture. 99.9% of Jews fit into their contribution to Mashiach in the spiritual sense. And therefore, in that sense, from the Hasidic perspective, the spiritual role is more important than the halachic, because it's where you can contribute. Moreover, in Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought, the physical world / the halachic world will always mirror the spiritual world. So if you are more spiritually refined, then the world itself will evolve more spiritually. Right? There's a famous Zohar, which is a prophetic Zohar, straight out. It's a Zohar in Parshas Noach. You can go look it up. It's coming up next week, so we can talk about it already in Parshas Noach. The pasuk describes the year of when the flood happened, and the pasuk says that there's water from above and water from below, the flood of the earth. So the Zohar takes that date and turns it into millennia, and says there's going to be an opening of wisdom from above, an opening of wisdom from below. Scientific knowledge and Torah knowledge will be exposed as a precursor to Mashiach's coming. And at that marker is around the same time when the Baal Shem Tov arrives, and the same time as the Industrial Revolution. The beginning of the spiritual revolution of Judaism, introducing Chassidus and Kabbalah to the masses, and the introduction and the physical revolution, the technological revolution, they happen simultaneously. And the way Chassidus understands this is that as the Jews evolve spiritually to a better place, so does the world / halachic evolve better. So it's not only that where can you choose to put your efforts, spiritual, halachic, and you can't do the halachic, so pick the spiritual. Your contribution on the spiritual front actually is what's going to help and push the world into its halachic perfect state. Right? So when you say you're bringing Mashiach in the spiritual sense, from the Chabad perspective, that is your biggest role, and that's going to make the halachic process come along more, and then God willing to converge, and then Mashiach comes. So, yeah, I hope that gives some little clarity to a difficult topic.
In my family, I have some, my shrer is, he doesn't go to see the Rebbe because he doesn't believe he's in the cave. I've just been exposed to that.
Now you're crossing out
anything.
Yeah.
But
that's where I think you're crossing halachic territory.
Crossing halachic territory. That's the can of worms.
So in other words, when halacha has to observe the physical reality on the ground.
Yeah.
That's how halacha works.
Well,
the spiritual, you can transcend these things when you're talking about the spiritual sense. Right?
A good example, like the Zohar mentions that Moshe Rabbeinu was buried in Israel. We know clearly he's buried in Chutz La'aretz.
The verse says clearly.
Clearly, it says clearly. So how's it possible that both are true? So I think that the answer is given.
Another example.
Sense
the Gemara says, the verse says clearly. We read it last week by Yomas Moshe.
Yeah.
Moshe died. And then the Gemara says, no, Moshe didn't die.
That's right.
The Gemara is contradicting the verse? Can't be. And Rashi discusses that there also, right? Rashi discusses it right there in the Chumash, F Shemesh Moshe, the whole thing. But again, you have to remember, when you're talking halachic, you have to look at the reality on the ground, the physical reality on the ground. Ein l'dayin ela ma she'ein rois. One cannot judge other than what their eyes see. And then you're talking about spiritual sense. When you're talking about spiritual sense, then David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayim. David, the king of Israel, is alive and well. King David was buried. We know where his grave is. At least some opinions know where his grave is. But we still sing David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayim, because here we are, spiritually speaking, living David's kingdom, as it were. Right? So you have to know when you're talking about what things. And then again, like I mentioned here, that if God decides, He can break the halachic pattern and say we're we're going with the spiritual Mashiach, pick some guy out of history and say, you're Mashiach. And if that's the way you want to look at any leader, I'm okay with that. As the Gemara clearly is.
You have no choice.
I mean, you have a choice. No, right?
If God puts him there, you're going to say,
No.
Yeah, God can choose every direction he wants, right?
choose somebody else. I don't like him.
All right, have a wonderful day, everybody.